All right, there's my American history class. I hope you guys are doing well. This is for the most of you, for the most part, I should say. Um, I would expect you guys will be watching this for the class on Monday, April 13th, and then the continuing portion will be for the 15th. So I'm going to make this a kind of a two-part deal, taking us through the 60s and kind of setting up the 1970s, the early period in particular. So we've already talked about the Vietnam War and some of the international realities. And the last time I recorded a Zoom lecture for you, we talked about the life and legacy of John F. Kennedy, and particularly what that meant for both domestic policy as well as foreign policy issues. So I wanted to go back through and start, kind of dealing with some of the turbulent moments of the 1960s. And I think I'd like to start by just mentioning, I've honestly, Professor Hills and I, we used to teach, Jim Hills and I used to teach a combined course that dealt with history, literature, philosophy, and art as well, called American Thought and Culture. And in that course, of course, we would walk our students through some of the realities of these different decades. And excuse me, just inhaled a bunch of dust actually. Sorry about that. There, I need some water. Okay, there we are. So, in our discussions, Professor Hills and I had some interesting conversations about the fact that we found it very strange that in our 21st century culture in America, there is this strange nostalgia for the 1960s, and this strange reverence for some reason of trying to be rebellious and find ways to be angsty, right, full of angst and upset and rebellion, as if that's somehow paying homage to this earlier period. Kind of like this, there's a generational desire for millennials and Gen Zers perhaps to have their own opportunity to rebel and take part in these these rebellious movements in their own time, just like their grandparents may have done in the mid 1960s. And I think, although I understand perhaps at some level, of course, because when we're teenagers we kind of think that way, and in early 20s we think our parents and grandparents, their generations got it all wrong and we'll get it all right and all that kind of stuff. And maybe there are some degrees of truth to that. I mean, it's not as if my parents' generation and my grandparents' generations, it's not as if they were perfectly measuring and applying their principles to their own time. And but get used to the reality that no human being, no generation of human beings has ever been able to do that. So we have to do the best that we can. The 1960s is one of the most tumultuous decades in American history, I would say, and I'm certainly not alone in this. Probably prior to the decade of the 2010s, I would say the 2010s have certainly been remarkably contentious as well. But other than the American Civil War going back to the 1860s, I think the 1960s, which is a full century later, saw some of the most kind of surreal turns of events that we can probably imagine historically, and so much contention, a lot of disagreement, a lot of tumult, as I've said, a great deal of reactionary mentalities. A lot of the rebellious movements were, at least in part, begun due to necessity, and I think for good purposes. But sometimes even the movements that began with good ethics and good purpose and good reason, even they began to degenerate. So it's a very interesting moment in our history. So let's kind of dig into the 1960s. So when Professor Hills and I talk about this nostalgia, oftentimes we would talk to our students and we'd say, so what is it about the 1960s that you guys are a little bit nostalgic for? And so students would start bringing to mind things like Woodstock, for instance, or the anti-war movement, as if the anti-war movement was some universal cohesive structure that was entirely altruistic, right? There may have been individuals and bits and pieces of the anti-war movement that were ethical and true, and yet much of it was actually different, was actually not. Woodstock is a great example of something that has garnered a lot of attention over the years. The Woodstock concert in New York back in the late 60s, whereby all of these, a lot of the generation, the teens and 20s of the late 60s, who'd become part of that kind of cultural backlash against tradition, against their parents and grandparents' generations, against the Vietnam War in part, but also against American political culture, against what I was saying a second ago, the social norms, the religious norms that had come before. And they decided to become part of what becomes known as the counterculture in the 1960s. A lot of drug abuse, an awful lot of drug abuse, marijuana, LSD, certainly the drugs of choice. There were others too, but those were probably the two key ones. And, Woodstock was, to be honest with you, it was just this, it wasn't just about music. I know people like to butter new generations up by making believe it was just all this, this harmless connection of human beings who were, some of them high on marijuana, others high on LSD, or maybe a combination of both, coming together in peace and love and enjoying good music together. Who could possibly object to something like that? And Professor Hills and I agree on this. I think he's exactly right. I would say Christians should certainly not be engaging in those kinds of activities, because the other thing that went on at Woodstock was an awful lot of sexual promiscuity. And I mean, just off the charts. So the nostalgia for that event, especially for Christians, probably shouldn't exist in the way that it sometimes seems to. So just trying to contextualize things kind of is important for us. Let's dig into a couple of things that we've already touched on briefly. I'm not going to spend much time on it right now. The Bay of Pigs, we've already touched on the fact that the Kennedy administration oversees the Bay of Pigs scenario, and we talked about the backlash against that, followed up by the construction of the Berlin Wall, and something that I ended with the other day when I was talking about Kennedy was the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably one of the great successes from a foreign policy standpoint of the Kennedy administration. So these are certainly elements to be framed within the Cold War that we've already talked about at some level. Very important for us, in fact. The Vietnam conflict. So this is the other thing I want to just frame for you as we talk about the 1960s. Vietnam has a long history, and we've actually to this point traced it from the early 1950s on through to 1965, 64, 1965, that neck of the woods. Well, the American involvement in Vietnam, as far as a formal military commitment, requiring a fair amount of constitutional funding and the actual use of a wartime draft to bring thousands and thousands of soldiers into the fray and to transport them over to Southeast Asia to engage in combat, that all really steps up in 1964 and 1965. There's a famous incident that your book, the American Yawp text, references, called the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. And that is the starting point where the buildup phase really goes into overdrive. So after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, in which I'm not going to go into all the details of that for you here, but it involved a partial engagement between U.S. destroyers and some North Vietnamese in the area, and there were both some phantom engagements, which is to say, uh, combat scenarios that did not actually take place, as well as a couple of things that did. So the U.S. destroyers were ostensibly fired upon a number of times. That's what the claim is, but the reality is there was probably only one incident in which a weapons system, a missile, was actually fired at a U.S. vessel. Nonetheless, this incident is used as a kind of a groundbreaking scenario to move the United States toward a war footing. And so, there's this, really, this just serves as a rationale. The Gulf of Tonkin incident leads to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is passed, and it really allows the chief executive, the president at this time being Lyndon Johnson, it gives him what we refer to typically as carte blanche, which is this open-ended ticket. He and his administration are allowed to oversee the Vietnam conflict and American involvement in the Vietnam conflict as a direct result of that resolution. U.S. troop presence in Vietnam is escalated dramatically beginning in 1965, and from 1965 on through 1968, the war progresses and U.S. troops are consistently, upgraded to greater and greater and greater numbers. This is really the high point of U.S. troop commitments in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam, in sharp contrast to those who claim that the Vietnam War all along was garnering a lot of negative press, that is simply not true. So the reality is this: from 1965 on through 1967 and into early 1968, most Americans didn't have any overly negative responses to the Vietnam War. Most Americans were actually confident that the war was actually being fought successfully and well and ethically and all the rest, and they believed that their sons, their husbands, their uncles, whoever was fighting over there, they believed that these men would be home reasonably soon, that the war would be over, and the United States would move on. They believed that the United States was in fact successfully carrying out their military policies and procedures in Vietnam. In a military history class, one of the things we talk about is the difference between the conduct of the U.S. war in Vietnam versus previous wars by the United States. Vietnam was unfortunately a very poorly strategized war, and a lot of the combat tactics used were problematic. There's also an over-reliance on technology in the Vietnam War, which certainly comes to the forefront during this period from 1965 to 1968 and 1969. And also there's a very strange decision to have 12-month deployments, whereby those who are serving in Vietnam are only there for 1 year, and then they are taken out of circulation and sent elsewhere. So the continuity of military personnel in the region is also a problem. There's a severe lack of understanding by our military high command on how to deal with an insurgent war in Southeast Asia. They've not learned some important lessons about previous circumstances in Southeast Asia. They've not learned about the lessons that they should have taken from French failure in Vietnam. And the war is just unfortunately becoming a war not only of attrition, it is becoming a protracted war, which means it is dragging on and on and on with seemingly no real end in sight. And what happens is that the United States High Command and the official stories that are sold to the American public make it seem, as I was saying a second ago, make it seem as if the war is going to be over soon, and that the American victory in Vietnam against the communist insurgent forces in the South and the North, that the American victory is somehow basically assured. And so here's where we have this transition point. The anti-war movements that you typically associate with Vietnam, those don't explode on the scene until 1968 and 1969, and then moving forward from there. And the reason actually comes in large measure because of an important moment. I want to deal with that real quickly here. So 1968, a tumultuous year for Americans. And so I have in the upper left-hand corner, I'm going to deal with the other parts of this slide in just a few minutes, but in the upper left-hand corner, you see there's this photograph of American Marines inside the embassy compound, the US embassy compound in Saigon, which is in South Vietnam. So here's what happens. The American people to that point in the Vietnam War had been largely, not entirely, but largely convinced that the war was progressing just fine. They'd been told that the American military initiatives were working, that the enemy was weakened, and that by all measurements, it appeared that within the year, the vast majority of American military forces would be coming back home. So the U.S. military high command actually brought one of its key commanders, William Westmoreland, back home in the fall of 1967 to engage in what was called the Victory Tour. The success offensive sometimes is another phrase that's used. And Westmoreland, the commanding general of U.S. forces in Vietnam, tours around America and gives all these speeches to American audiences talking about the successes of the Vietnam conflict, the American strategies and tactics that he says are working magically and well, and that will allow the war to come to a grinding halt very soon. The problem stems from the fact that ultimately this is proven false, and it happens in a very drastic and a very public way. So after all of these convincing speeches, after all of essentially what becomes rightly labeled as propaganda, the American people wake up in January of 1968 to a sequence of news stories that begin to sweep across our country. Many of these dealing specifically with Vietnam. And what they are exposed to is the reality of something called the Tet Offensive. It's T-E-T offensive, referring to the Vietnamese New Year. And the Tet Offensive was essentially a bunch of coordinated attacks, primarily centered in South Vietnam, undertaken by both the Viet Cong and supported by the North Vietnamese military, intended to break up the resistance, the American and South Vietnamese loyalists' resistance in the South. And these coordinated attacks were unbelievably difficult to throw back, to put aside. Now, the Tet Offensive was ultimately put back. So the Vietnamese offensive, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong offensive against the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies, that offensive did not ultimately succeed from a tactical perspective and even from a military strategic perspective. So the United States was able to defend these various positions throughout South Vietnam. But the result that's most critical is that it showed what the Tet Offensive revealed was that the fiction that the war was coming to a screeching halt and that the American combat experience was about to end and that American military policy was working, that whole idea comes to a screeching halt. And what the American people began to question is the whole policy, the whole American policy in South Vietnam. So they're basically left with a couple of alternatives, right? So the American people are left to question, after they've been told that the war is coming to an end, they're left to ask the critical question of, all right, does this mean that this either means that we have been lied to by our politicians and our military leadership, who may have known all along that the war was not progressing as they hoped it would progress. Or the other alternative, I suppose, could be that they're so clueless they actually believed we were winning the war, when in reality the enemy is very strong and very committed, and there's really no end in sight. As I'm sure you probably realize right now, neither of those options is a good one. If you're being lied to by your politicians and military leaders, that's bad, especially if you have a son or a husband or an uncle or a brother fighting overseas in Vietnam. That's certainly not something you want to think of. But the other alternative, that the leadership was absolutely clueless about how to prosecute the Vietnam War, and that their various strategies and tactical operational plans were actually invalid and really did not apply and were not working. Okay, that's also not a good alternative. So either one is really not going to sit well, and this produces the Tet Offensive. So beginning in 1968, this produces a massive reaction on the part of many in America, even some who continued to generally support the continuation of the war began to have more serious questions. But obviously, you also have a good portion of Americans who begin to increasingly fear that this is not the right war, that we shouldn't be there, and they want their sons and their brothers and their husbands and whoever. They want these men coming home. They want them to be sent home from the Vietnam War. So the anti-war resistance movement that begins in our country really, picks up pace and swings up into, into becoming a recognizable entity in American culture as a direct result of the Tet Offensive in 1968. So that is kind of the context for that I wanted you to be aware of. Okay, back home, let's go back here a little bit. So back home in the United States, there are a couple of things that are going on. Obviously, we've been dealing a little bit with the civil rights movement and its origins, going back to elements like the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King's introduction to the American public in the 1950s. By 1963 and 64, we have some really important things going on. So one of the things that I want you to do is to go online and access Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. The American Yawp text references it, but the link that I tried to use for my, when I was in the American Yawp that I clicked on didn't seem to work well. So honestly, you can just go to YouTube and, click Martin Luther King Jr. or type in Martin Luther King Jr. "I Have a Dream" speech, and I want you to listen to it. It's one of the most amazing speeches in American history, where he talks about his vision for America's present and its future. And he's obviously encouraging and is hopeful for a great deal of healing, and he's hopeful for a much more harmonious racial existence or racial relationships in American society moving forward from 1963. So that speech occurs in August of 63. It's one of the more famous and actually very, very important. So I'd like you to go and listen to that speech. It's especially the last sequence. It's one of the greatest that you'll probably get to hear this semester. It's really a wonderful speech. So Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously the key individual, but there are others that are certainly working as part of this broad civil rights movement. So it's not just Martin Luther King Jr. He just becomes probably the most well-known face of the civil rights movement. And as a result of his notions of peaceful protest, I think that really gives his movement, similar to Gandhi's movement back in the 1940s. What Martin Luther King Jr. is doing, with his, nonviolent scenarios, his push for equality through nonviolence is actually really critical in allowing for the U.S. Congress and for our political leadership to begin taking these moments much more seriously. And Lyndon Johnson, although Lyndon Johnson in many respects as a Southerner, as a Texan, growing up in that part of the country, certainly probably had in his own life, and certainly with his constituents in Texas, certainly racism would have been a reality. And yet Lyndon Johnson certainly does seize upon this moment pretty interestingly. And he and Martin Luther King Jr. Do meet each other. There are contexts between the Johnson administration and various civil rights leaders about the importance of this moment and pushing for significant, meaningful, powerful legislation. And Johnson, to his credit, regardless of his, maybe his ancient past and his youth, and regardless of some of the rhetoric that we might have heard coming from Johnson himself in previous years, Johnson seems to understand the importance of this moment. And he really does push through significant real legislation that other politicians either didn't care to push through, didn't think was politically convenient for them to push through, resisted because of their own racism, perhaps. There are a lot of different reasons, right? And Johnson deserves some credit here. I don't want to dismiss this, because it was not really, the civil rights legislation that comes through in 1964, which is the Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, very significant moves here. Those would not have come about without a significant push from the chief executive, and without Johnson making these hallmarks of his whole domestic push for the Great Society. So there is certainly some politicking going on with Johnson. He's a politician after all, but it's not just that. And so Martin Luther King Jr., Lyndon Johnson, and the American political landscape, this is all coming to a head in the mid-1960s. And those pieces of legislation are very significant in moving our country forward. I don't want to minimize the effect that ultimately was able to have. There is a lot of upheaval, though. I want you to get this as well. As the civil rights movement continues forward, remember that it's not just Martin Luther King's vision for equality. You have other competing visions, and there were a number of other civil rights leaders that emerged in the 1960s, like Malcolm X, for instance, who were much more interested in immediate change by force if necessary. And they were not advising nonviolent resistance. They were not advising those strategies and tactics as the best way forward. And so there was a fair amount of contention. When these various contending ideas came into conflict, you often had physical realities, physical symptoms of these realities coming to the forefront. And those realities could mean that minority Americans in places like LA, the Watts riots is on the screen here. So there could be confrontations between Black Americans who were taking the more violent approach in some areas. You also had the opposite element of this, would be that some white Americans were continuing to find ways to resist the push for civil rights movement, for civil rights changes in our country. So all of this to say, as you read through the American Yawp text, what you need to realize is that this is a highly contentious environment. And it bred a great deal of concern, a lot of paranoia, a lot of delusion, and many Americans, white and Black alike, were finding themselves in scenarios that they probably couldn't have dreamed of being in existence or dreamed of happening even a year or two earlier. And so the civil rights movement, all of the, nowadays we typically look back on that period, and rightly so, as such a crucial move forward. And it couldn't, I suppose we should be realists and understand that nothing, even something that is so profoundly good and necessary, even that could not have come without a great deal of upheaval and a great deal of of contention, and that certainly is the case. So the civil rights era ultimately produced a great good, and we need to recognize that, of course. But I do want you to understand that the tumultuous realities of the civil rights movement touched Americans in ways that many had not anticipated, and that is certainly also part of this. So the Yop text mentions these things in passing, and I wanted you to be aware of them. John Kennedy, we've talked about his assassination. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to post for Wednesday the 15th. I'm going to come back to this topic and in the 1960s, and we're going to talk a little bit more about LBJ's Great Society, because I think it merits a little bit more attention. And we're going to start talking about the transitions from the late 1960s into the 1970s a little bit more. And that's because I want to try to explain that in a much more contextual framework, but I want to take the time to connect some things that I haven't done thus far here. So that's where we're going. Stay up with the Yop reading. And obviously, I want you to watch this video, which you've obviously at this point been watching it if you've clicked on it. So keep looking for my video posts and keep watching those. I think they're gonna, my intention is that they will be good syntheses, bringing together some of the disparate pieces you've been reading in the Yop text. I hope you're doing really well, guys, and hope that you had a really wonderful Easter weekend. I will connect with you soon vis-a-vis these posts. Take care. Bye-bye.